Biztech's technology show. Today, the conversation is around data centers, which are mushrooming across the globe, but particularly, of course, in the Asia-Pacific region. One of the largest players providing industry market intelligence and data is DC Byte. Now, to tell us more about the company and the industry, we have our guest today, James Murphy. He's the APAC Managing Director for DC Byte. James, welcome to the show.
Ryan, great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Now, James, lovely to have you. Give us an overview of DC Byte and its history.
Yeah, sure. DC Byte is a data center intelligence firm, as you mentioned. We were founded and headquartered in the UK 2017-2018 timeframe. And in that time, we've kind of mushroomed up to become the market leader in tracking data center assets, initially in Europe, but now we're tracking them all over the world.
Now, could you give us some idea of the sort of solutions and services you offer clients, and then how they actually use them?
Yeah, sure. So we've got a couple of different buckets of clients. So data center operators themselves, I think most of the major operators globally will use our solution. A lot of the funds behind this, so whether it be the big ones that begin with B, I'm not going to name specifics, but you can kind of two and two together and figure out some of the ones I'm talking about. They'll use our services, again, to kind of back their investment decisions. And then we also work with management consultancy firms, property consultancy firms as well, to ensure that they've got the latest view of what's happening in a market. How we really provide them value is we track assets at an individual level and build in a view from a bottom-up approach. So in order to do this, we look at, I think, close to 7,000 assets globally now. And we look at how much capacity they currently have live, how much potential they have, and if they have a path to more capacity on that individual site, which then leads us up to a city level, a region level, a country level, a Southeast Asia level, for example. So it allows our clients to get as granular as they want with individual assets, or have kind of a broad market overview, depending on what they need and when.
Okay, research is only as good as the raw data that comes out and the methodology around the data and the sample size. Walk us through how you make sure that you provide that really high quality solution and reliable data and intelligence.
Well, first of all, it's by throwing bodies at it. So I don't think anyone has got a team as big as ours. So I think we're now up to, as of yesterday, I think we're up to 21 analysts around the world. So these analysts are all based in regions. So we've got a number in Europe, we've got a number in the Americas, and then we've got a number who sit here in Singapore. So first of all, it's a volume of analysts. By having a large number of analysts, it means that they can get quite specific and they can get quite detailed on the markets which they cover. So for example, an analyst in APAC might be across 2, sometimes 3, 4 countries, but never any more than that. That ensures that they can have all the conversations they need to have. That ensures that they can actually get into market frequently and actually physically meet with people, physically verify the facilities, and just ensure that what is being kind of announced in the press and what some of the data center operators, developers are announcing is actually in sync with what's actually happening in reality.
Now, James, then unpack for us, given that scenario, unpack for us the growth the industry has seen, particularly in the last few years, and some of the key drivers of that growth.
So yeah, the kind of the industry at the moment is kind of doubling in size every 3 or 4 years. Up until now, that growth has largely been driven by the adoption of cloud technology. So that will be driven by the likes of Microsoft, Google, AWS. In APAC, we've got some of the Chinese players as well. So people like Alibaba, Tencent. So these guys are bringing a lot of people online, and a lot more people are using cloud services. And to a degree, APAC is still catching up in some markets. Like a lot of the emerging markets are only now in the process of having individual cloud regions. So Malaysia, for example, the Philippines, some of these countries are still kind of in the very early stages of their cloud journey. And that requires a huge amount of data center capacity. What's added additional fuel to the fire, and a further catalyst is now AI. So AI, it's hard to get away from it. You're hearing it everywhere you go, in all sorts of different contexts. AI requires a huge amount of compute. Compute needs data centers. So in an APAC context, like I said, some of the emerging markets in particular are still playing catch up and still bringing online cloud services, and more people are adopting these in their businesses and in their personal lives. But then on top of that, AI is coming in as well. So it's kind of two things happening at the same time, which is causing like enormous growth across, well, globally and also across APAC as well.
And I suppose the challenges, as you've alluded to, are around the differing levels of maturity in terms of cloud adoption. Also, of course, differing regulatory and infrastructure-related landscapes around the region. Now, I want to zoom in on one example that you pointed out. It's around Malaysia, and Malaysia's, I think in the southern Malaysian region, there's 18 new data centers being built. I could be wrong, but I think it's a number as big as that. And isn't that fueled by the fact that no new data centers or regulatory landscape has changed in Singapore, and people were forced to then build them in Malaysia? Is that the case, or what are some of the other factors that have been contributing to this?
Yeah, so in the case of southern Malaysia or Johor Bahru, it's both push and pull factors. So as you rightly said, Singapore has had a moratorium in place for the last number of years, where it's been very difficult for new data center developments to take place. And so people who wanted capacity in and around Singapore were no longer able to look at Singapore. So two kind of potential options emerged. One was Johor, as you mentioned. The other was Batam. So when I talk about pull factors, I think Johor's got a lot of pull factors, which even Singapore, were it to be open and were there to be no regulatory challenges, Johor does have some advantages. So Johor, land prices are literally a fraction of what they are in Singapore, which means that you can build the kind of campuses or data centers which you might see in North America or Europe, which are generally single-story buildings or sometimes two-story buildings, but you can build them horizontally as opposed to vertically. So Singapore, you'll see a lot of data centers which are multiple stories, which is quite rare in other regions. So it just well, first of all, it's cheaper, and it also means that there's less engineering challenges and things like that. There's also an abundance of power in Johor right now, so there's no challenges around securing power or getting the power to your actual site, which can be a bit of a challenge in Singapore. Singapore obviously has to import pretty much all of its power, whereas Malaysia is a power generator and exports power, which just means that the access to power is generally easier. So to answer your question, I think people were pushed out of Singapore because, like I said, the moratorium made it pretty much impossible for new developments to take place. But at the same time, there were a lot of pull factors which made Johor a very attractive and kind of logical destination. So I think even now, were the moratorium to be lifted, I think people now can see the benefits of Johor, and I think Johor would have developed regardless of any moratorium in Singapore.
Now, James, but this leaves another question. It's around my earlier question around the regulatory framework. In the past, particularly in the financial services sector, the data has to reside within the same geographical location, especially for mission-critical data. How has that changed in the event of cloud and AI and the pushing out of data centers? And let's use the Singapore example as a very specific example. Have the laws and regulations changed around this to keep pace with what's happening in the commercial sector?
So I think when you, like in answering that question, you have to look at the kind of workloads which are based in a country. So as you mentioned, Singaporean data or financial data or health records or anything like that, people in Singapore don't need to worry. That data is going to continue to be housed in Singapore. What the likes of Johor have been able to attract is some of these huge requirements around AI and things like that, where it might not be dealing with consumers' individual data. So they might be
more
doing
compute power and things like that.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of summarizing it, actually. So it will be these big, large language models up there, which are kind of more about compute processing rather than dealing with yours or my health records, for example. So people don't need to be worried about that. There will always, like Singapore is always going to be an important hub for data centers and data and connectivity because it's got a kind of a legacy in that space. But what we're likely to see in Johor and other markets which are popping up is different types of data centers catering to different requirements and different workloads. So some of the large compute stuff, as I mentioned, will likely go to places like Johor, whereas sensitive customer data is likely to remain in country, not only in Singapore, but in other markets across the region. So people don't need to worry about data sovereignty or any of those kind of issues. They will remain domestic issues.
James, I'm going to ask, however, in the data center business, there's an uglier side of it, and that's around the sheer amount of resources and energy, whether it's water, whether it's energy that data centers consume. How is this impacting the industry as a whole, and particularly in the APAC region?
Yeah, so absolutely. This is a challenge, but to use a bit of a cliche, challenges also present a lot of opportunities. So the data center industry as a whole, and in APAC, is well aware of this challenge. And if you look at some of the major users of compute power globally, the likes of Google, Microsoft, Amazon, they're actually some of the leading buyers and off-takers of green energy globally. So they are doing their bit in a lot of the more mature markets, let's say like North America or Europe, but we're increasingly seeing them with PPA agreements and buying green energy in places like Australia. So they are doing their part. And I think it was Schneider Electric who came up with the phrase additionality. So data centers are a perfect off-taker for green energy because let's say someone wants to develop a wind farm or a solar farm or any sort of green energy project. Data centers have pretty much got a instant and very stable demand profile, which means if you need financing for let's say a wind farm, for example, and there's a data center nearby that needs the energy, they will be like the load will be pretty stable and they can help finance some of these projects, which were it left to kind of normal market conditions, these developments may not get built. So there's a bit of joint up thinking required, but data centers can actually help bring on a lot of this green energy, which otherwise may not be able to get financed in kind of without the kind of data centers there. So like the industry as a whole is aware of the problem, is aware that they are kind of seen as these energy monsters. However, they can kind of be part of a solution and they can actually help bring more green energy online with a bit of joint up thinking and with a bit of forward thinking by the various governments, the various energy bodies, various utility providers. So I think data centers, like I said, can actually emerge from this as the good guy.
Interesting perspective there. And then what does the future of the data center industry look like? I mean, where are the opportunities, where are the innovations going to come from? I'm thinking in terms of edge computing as well, that's going to change the game besides AI as well. And quantum computing.
Yeah, so like all of those different types of computer are all in some way related. So I think we're going to see a situation where we've got there's a new term, AI factories, which are essentially mega data centers. And these data centers don't need to be necessarily in population centers, which a typical cloud data center typically needs to be relatively close. And then when we talk about edge as well, so edge means a lot of different things to different people, but these edge facilities are likely to pop up in more city center locations. And the whole ecosystem is going to be complementary to each other. So we're not going to have AI factories in downtown locations. Like we're not going to see any pop up in Singapore, but I think we will see some of these edge style facilities, which will be working with some of these AI factories to ensure that people are able to use the latest technologies on their phone, in their cars, in the office, wherever it might be. So all of these different technologies have a part to play with each other. They're all interconnected in some way to ensure that computing gets done where it's most efficient, but then these edge facilities are in hand to ensure that when we need something in milliseconds that we have access to it. So yeah, it's a really exciting place, and I don't think we or anyone for that matter knows exactly how it's going to look and exactly how things will pan out. But there's a lot of interesting things being discussed, and yeah, it's going to be an exciting next couple of years as we see how some of these things pan out.
James, your remit is APAC. Where do you see in the next 12 to 24 months in particular, the big growth opportunities in terms of countries?
It's the growth opportunities. Like, I think if you're looking at it on a per capita basis, some of the emerging markets who are still playing catch up are going to see huge growth, admittedly from a lower base. So we might see the size of their markets increase 20, 30, 50, 100% in some cases. So there's going to be a lot of growth in markets like the Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, admittedly from a low base. But also in some of the larger markets. So demand for data center capacity in Tokyo, for example, is very high. Sydney, very high. Melbourne, very high. Still quite strong in Hong Kong. Were there not a moratorium in Singapore, I think we would see extremely strong demand here. India is booming. So I don't think there's literally a single major market across the region where the data center industry isn't facing challenges around getting enough power, around getting enough people to actually help build and operate these data centers. So the whole industry is going crazy. And if you attend any events around the region, you'll see record attendees, you'll see interest from all the financial houses, banks, whatever it might be. So the whole region is going completely crazy right now. And yeah, I don't think there's one market which isn't doing well or hasn't got the potential to kind of multiply in size in the next 5-10 years.
James, it's been a great conversation. You've really kept, I think, the audience and myself really updated in terms of what's happening in the industry. But before we leave, any final thoughts or key takeaways you'd like to leave the audience with?
No, I would just say if you are interested in the data center industry, do get in touch. It's growing at an incredible clip. There's opportunities for data centers and different types of data centers all over the region. So yeah, feel free to get in touch with myself or any of my analyst team. Because now I think if you're not in it already, I think now is the right time to get in and yeah, join this rocket ship.
James, thank you very much for taking your time to be on the show.
Ryan, thank you for having me.
I'm Brian Fernandez, and we've been speaking to James Murphy, the APAC Managing Director for DC Byte. This has been Biztech's Technology Show. This interview will be on our website, www.biztech.asia, as well as our syndication partners, TV stations, radio stations, and websites. Thanks a lot for tuning in.